What to make of the new Muqtada al-Sadr? It's coalition building time after Iraq's first post-ISIS general election. And look who's a surprise first. The one-time arch-nemesis of US-led forces in Baghdad, who hibernated in Iran after his sectarian militia was flushed out of Baghdad and Basra a decade ago. The scion of a powerful family of clerics is back. This time, though, with a reformist agenda that draws in secular voters and the left and supporters who chant anti-Iran's slogans. Is their Iraq first message for real? Muqtada al-Sadr may have finished tops. His bloc, though, can only rule in a coalition. So, between the 5,000 U.S. troops currently in the country to back and train the National Army and the Shia militias who directly get their funding from Tehran, who will have the ear of Iraq's next government? And where does the latest escalation between the Trump administration and Iran leave Iraq? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the makeover of Muqtada al-Sadr, and joining us from Washington, senior policy fellow at Johns Hopkins University and the author of Reclaiming Iraq, Abbas Kadim. Also joining us this time from Istanbul, Borzu Daragahi, who has written on who the main players may be in forming the next government for foreign policy. Always a pleasure to welcome you, Borzu, to the show. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Listen, if you will, to the rallying cries posted on social media. Iran out, Baghdad is free. This video of Baghdad's Tahrir Square posted May 18th on YouTube. It purports to show supporters of Muqtada al-Sadr. Borzu Daragahi, what should we make of that video and that chant?
Well, I think there is definitely a strong element inside Iraq that resents not only Iranian power exercising itself inside Iraq and within the halls of power, but also other foreign powers. Muqtada al-Sadr has managed to capture some of that spirit. There's other leaders as well who've campaigned on an anti-Iranian or an anti-Iranian and anti-American sort of platform. But Muqtada al-Sadr has the brand, he has the base of supporters that drew a lot more votes than the other coalitions and managed to put himself in a sort of kingmaker, if not a king-like position.
Abbas Kadim, are you surprised by the results of the election?
Not at all. The results of the elections reflect similar makeup to what we had in the past. It's just that we have different groups now. So all of the 183 seats that used to be owned by the Shia alliance now are divided by the same groups, but they run separately. Same thing with the other makeup. But probably the one thing that might have looked different than the predictions is that Muqtada al-Sadr would have more seats than, for example, the coalition that ran on the PMU platform or name. Also, the prime minister coming third and fifth, actually, in Baghdad. That's kind of really came to, and of course the numbers shifted, third, second, etc. But definitely not winning. It kind of surprised many people.
Why? Why did he finish? Why did he finish
and many of his
third?
Were counting that he would win this election. Because of several things. One of them is that his single issue that he ran on defeating ISIS did not or could not claim the credit for alone. There was a group, a coalition that was running on the same credentials, the PMU coalition. So he shared that credit. And then all of the last 4 years, his governance record has been quite frankly a failure. They did not check the boxes on services, on anti-corruption, on the economy, on many other issues. So running on one issue and sharing it with others, that's not a recipe for winning an election in a place like Iraq.
Muqtada al-Sadr's party finished first with 54 seats. It's well shy of the 165, though, needed to form a government. Muqtada al-Sadr meeting over the weekend with the outgoing prime minister. We've just been talking about him, Haider al-Abadi, whose Victory Alliance, as Abbas was saying, faded to third in the voting despite leading the fight against ISIS. Abadi still considered by many, though, as the consensus candidate. Muqtada al-Sadr, who won't be the next prime minister since he himself did not run for parliament, and acting as a man of consensus.
Actually, that's not exactly. He can actually constitutionally run. It's just he's not.
Meant to deliver a clear message and to assure all the Iraqi people that our government will be a caring and inclusive one, which will cover everyone without marginalizing anyone in order to achieve reform and prosperity. A caring government that pays attention to all the Iraqi people without distinguishing. Our hand is extended and our door is open to anyone as long as they want to build our nation, and that it be an Iraqi decision and remain sovereign over our territory and people. God willing, we will work quickly towards achieving the aspirations and hopes of our people.
All right, a bit of platitudes in what we heard there, Borzu Daragahi. Can you translate for us what he's saying in straight talk?
I mean, it's hard to figure out what Muqtada Sadr's game is, but one has to be suspicious. When Muqtada Sadr's people controlled ministries a decade or so ago, they did a terrible job. They did a really bad job with the health ministry, for example. Sadrists infiltrated the interior ministry, and even though Muqtada himself has disavowed some of the abuses that militias did in his name, you know, he is the guy who spawned this whole militia complex inside Iraq. First there was the Mahdi army, and that split off and other formations came about. So he bears a lot of the responsibility for that. He doesn't have a great record on running the government. His people, he's been in government before. His people have been in government before. So I'm not sure what's going to come of this. What Muqtada Sadr is a almost a Hamlet-like, a Shakespearean figure in Iraqi history, a guy whose father and uncle were very big. They were gigantic figures in the Shia clergy. He sees it as his sort of birthright to claim their throne, so to speak. And to me, that makes him an object of caution. You got to be careful about what he wants. He's the kind of person, I think, who would probably tell any constituency what he thinks they want to hear in order to advance. He may not even be aware of what he's doing, but I think that you know, he read the situation well. There is a anti-incumbent mood out there. He played on that. There's a desire for reform and fresh faces. Almost none of the people running on his list of candidates was an incumbent, and I think that helped. And he also came at a time when there's not a lot of enthusiasm for politics. I think the key number to look at is 44% turnout in this election compared to the 60% or so in the previous election 4 years ago. And his very enthusiastic supporters managed to take advantage of that. They did show up, whereas other people did not.
Their supporters showed up, others did not. You mentioned Muqtada al-Sadr, who will say different things to different audiences. He didn't just meet with the outgoing prime minister over the weekend. He also met with the second place finishers, the pro-Iranian Conquest Alliance, made up of ex-fighters from mainly Shiite paramilitary units that battled IS, and whose leader, Hadi al-Amari, headed the Badr brigades. Borzu, Muqtada al-Sadr, his supporters are chanting Iran out. When you see him there sitting next to Hadi al-Amari, do you say to yourself, well, he could pivot back?
I mean, some supporters could chant Iran out. Others could be on the payroll of Iran. I think Muqtada al-Sadr spent quite a bit of time in Iran. I'm sure he has his allies in the clergy and in the political elite of Iran. I think that he will not, and I think this is a key thing for Tehran, he will not violate Iran's red lines. He will not begin lobbying missiles at Iran, which is what happened during the Iran-Iraq war, and that has been a cause of concern among Iranians. He will not, allow 100,000 U.S. or other foreign troops into the country. So I think the Iranians are fine with him. If he wants to play to the crowd a little bit by, chanting against Iran a bit to whip up support for himself, I think that people understand that politics is politics.
And what about crossing Washington's red lines?
I think that might turn into a problem at some point. On the other hand, I think that Iraq is in the situation that it is in now. It needs as much international support as it can get. Haider al-Abadi, one thing that he has managed to do, and I'm sure that the esteemed Dr. Kadhim would agree with this, even though he has failed in many respects, he's managed to patch up relations with not only all of the world's superpowers, including the US and Russia and so on, but also with all of Iraq's neighbors. This is an unprecedented moment. Haider al-Abadi has established good relations between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, between Iraq and Turkey, much less between Iraq and Jordan, which always had pretty good relations, Iraq and Iran, which have had good relations since the downfall of Saddam. Even Iraq and Kuwait now have positive, constructive relations. And this is something that you can't deny from him, and this is something that I think would make him a good front man for any government coalition, including one that had the blessing of Muqtada al-Sadr.
Abbas Kadhim, you agree?
Well, there are many points. I certainly see what Berzo is saying, and yes, Muqtada al-Sadr has probably aligned with Abadi on a couple of things that are very important. One of them is he is willing, or he has in fact reached out to the rest of the Arab world. He visited Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that is similar to the policy of Abadi. Both of the men do demand an Iraqi foreign policy that does not sit in one camp or the other. So taking Iraq out of the regional and international conflict is something they both agree. But for Sadr, of course, it's different than Abadi. I mean, being against Iran or even not very close to Iran is not a fatalism that they have to be close to the United States. For Abadi, he is closer to the West than to Iran, but for Sadr, he is distant from both of them. But I do agree with Berzo, is that basically being anti-Iran is too strong a term. I think he would like many Iraqis and the followers of Muqtada al-Sadr, would like to pursue a nationalist agenda that will keep Iran as a good neighbor with good fences, but not necessarily anti-Iran per se, because I don't think any wise Iraqi government would run on an agenda being anti-Iran. Iran is a neighbor that shares a more than 850 miles with Iraq of land border. It is number one in the economic exchange. There is a long history. There are a lot of affinities. And let's face it, most Iraqis would find it easier for them to go to Iran and come back and exchange than with the rest of the region. And this is, again, part of the failure of the regional politics from the Arab side, is they isolated Iraq and Iran opened its borders and it was more conducive. So I don't think it is wise to go anti-Iran, but definitely it is important and it is mandatory for an Iraqi government to succeed, is to guard Iraq's sovereignty and not allow certain elements of Iranian intelligence and Quds Force and others to be using Iraq as a theater to settle scores with regional enemies or international enemies. And these two things need to be balanced very well.
And the one issue that helped him bring together secularists, people from the left, was the promise to reform, to fight Iraq's rampant corruption. Are you holding your breath, Abbas Kadim?
Fighting corruption takes more than just wishes or promises. Corruption has been in Iraq since before 2003, and there is a huge mafia that is all over Iraq. It is becoming a culture, and also corruption is not pennies. We are talking about billions of dollars that exchange hands or corrupt hands, and that is important. So it takes more than just campaign promises, and I don't believe that the next government, which will be fragile and wobbly because of the current balance of powers, will be much anti-corruption. This is
won't be able to do so.
I'm not holding my breath on.
You're not holding your breath,
that.
Abbas Kadim. We're going to have to take a very quick break. And then we'll be back for more. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at a situation where it could be, well, Muqtada al-Sadr in the middle between Iran and the United States. The big winner of Iraq's general election is poised to play kingmaker in the formation of a new government, the once archnemesis of the United States after the 2003 invasion. With us to talk about it, Borzu Daragahi, France 24 contributor, and who's written on Iraq, his most recent piece in Foreign Policy. Abbas Kadim, Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back to the show. And we're joined for part two of our discussion, Douglas Herbert, who's been snooping around to see what the State Department thinks about matters pertaining to this region. We'll be talking to Doug in a moment. First, just a reminder again, he's only 44 years old, and yet Muqtada al-Sadr has been on the scene in Iraq for quite a while. And the one we're hearing today is a far different one from the one who defied George W. Bush's U.S.-led invasion back in the early days of 2003, 2004.
I only want independence and stability for Iraq, and for administrative and political matters to be handled by honorable Iraqis. I will not interfere from far away or nearby. My aim in this country is martyrdom. I have no political or administrative aim.
Borzu Daragahi, those early days, again, after the 2003 invasion and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, when was the first time that you remember Muqtada al-Sadr making a splash?
I mean, this goes way back to 2003, the summer of 2003, that hot, long summer when Muqtada al-Sadr began speaking out against the U.S.-led occupation of the country. And he announced plans for what he called the Mahdi Army, and started setting up tables at mosques and other places throughout Baghdad and in the south of Iraq, with people coming and signing up, sometimes, you know, poor young men in slippers, sometimes barefoot, signing up to join the Mahdi Army. And I recall many of the U.S. officials there kind of ignoring it, you know, considering it a joke.
Considering it a joke, but then later on, there were pitched battles.
There were, you know, I mean, I think that the U.S. bears a lot of responsibility for needlessly antagonizing Muqtada al-Sadr and his supporters. I think they had no understanding of what Sadr signified in the Shia religious cultural world, the family, the importance that the family held for, especially for poor Shia Iraqis, many coming from rural backgrounds, just arriving in Iraq cities and so on, and having no real people to look up to, no one to look up to. His family was very important to those people. And so, yes, there was, you know, the Mahdi Army became a rather formidable force in some ways, and it spawned other militias. Some of those were infiltrated by Iran. Some of those became Iranian tools to fight against the U.S. and give the U.S. a black eye so that it would not even think about launching a preemptive invasion of Iran. And so Iraq became a battleground for these two powers. And many fear that that could happen again, and this is a different subject, with the apparent possible impending collapse of the nuclear deal.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a moment, but just what's the calculus, in your view, in Washington right now? Do those in positions of power, and many of them are military, they remember the Iraq War vividly back in 2003, Borzu. Are they ready to do business with Muqtada al-Sadr?
I think that the U.S. State Department and the U.S. military, to the extent that it has people on the ground in that capacity, would be willing to do business with Muqtada al-Sadr. I think that whether the White House would be willing to okay that is another question that I don't know. But I think that Muqtada al-Sadr would be very reluctant to do business, so to speak, with the Americans. I mean, perhaps through intermediaries, perhaps through politicians inside the Green Zone, and others, and surrogates and so on. He would talk to them, perhaps indirect messages, but I don't think he would sit down in a back room with the U.S. ambassador, for example.
All right, Borzu mentioning how Iran is sort of shaping the conversation in the region right now. When he spoke Monday before the Hawkish Heritage Foundation think tank, the new U.S. Secretary of State took aim at Iran and what Mike Pompeo sees as its expansionist designs, everywhere from Afghanistan to Yemen.
Iran will never again have carte blanche to dominate the Middle East. And I would remind the leadership in Iran what President Trump said. If they restart their nuclear program, it will mean bigger problems than they'd ever had before.
Now, Abbas Kadim, here's the interesting bit. Mike Pompeo in that speech, again, mentioned places like Afghanistan and Yemen and Lebanon and Syria. He didn't mention Iraq. Why?
Well, there was an issue of saying that Iran has destroyed the Iraqi armed forces or is destroying the Iraqi armed forces. And, there are several other. But I think the U.S. administration right now is trying not to drag Iraq into the U.S.-Iran dispute. And that has been a constant request of the Iraqi government, especially at the fragile time of post-elections. What the U.S. needs right now is a policy. It has not had a policy towards Iraq. I wrote actually a piece on 50 years of U.S. Foreign policy towards Iraq, and I titled it Opting for the Lesser Evil. And that has been the U.S. always. When things fall apart, they see which is the lesser evil, and then they support it. We do need a coherent policy towards Iraq. There hasn't been one, not just in the past few years, there hasn't been one ever. And I think the State Department and the White House and everybody need to put their heads together and get a coherent policy instead of watching Iraq unfold. And when things come in a bad scenario, they begin complaining. They will be complaining a long time if they continue this kind of incoherence in their policy towards Iraq.
No Iraq policy, but there is an Iran policy. One viewer on the hashtag F24 debate saying Muqtada al-Sadr is a murderer who has American blood on his hands. But now we're okay with him just because it happens that he does not like Iran. And Iran, if I had $1 for every time that came up in conversation earlier, Douglas, when you were speaking with a State Department official, I guess, what would you say? I'd be...
Iran is the flavor of the day in Washington. But I think you're right. We just heard that there is no coherent strategy in Iraq. You could make the argument as well that the Trump administration, despite appearances to the contrary, has no coherent strategy or policy with regard to Iran.
No strategy? There is...
Listen, let me finish, Francois. The best part's coming. What they do have is a reality show style, very, very belligerent new policy is outlined, but there's no real alternative. We've still not heard what is being called the Plan B after Donald Trump unilaterally pulled out of this Iran deal. Now, the policy advisor I spoke to today, his name's Brian Hook, senior policy advisor to Mike Pompeo, new in the job, obviously, because Mike Pompeo's new in that job. Essentially, the term that kept coming up is a comprehensive approach. We've heard this time and again. We know that the original Iran nuclear deal was deliberately narrow. Deliberately, they chose to focus on the nuclear issue in order to get a deal done. And the argument now is that I asked, well, if you're lumping everything together, and Boris Johnson, the UK Foreign Secretary, has made this argument, calling it the new jumbo Iran strategy by the US, by trying to throw everything, absolutely everything in the bathwater in there, aren't you making any deal absolutely impossible to arrive at? You're just overcomplicating the thing. There's no way that you will get Iran to comply to all of these ultimatums on all these fronts. So that is what I mean when I say there's no real coherent, thought-out strategy. It's more about, at this point, I would say, the onus has been about ripping up an old deal, which for any number of reasons, without having a clear sense of how they're going to replace it, what they're going to replace it with, and more importantly, how they're ever going to get Iran on board with any of these new demands.
Borzu Dargahi, do you agree? Well, you just heard Douglas say there's no strategy specifically on Iran, and there's no firm strategy on Iraq from Abbas Qadim. Do you agree?
I'm not even sure what the word strategy means in terms of this administration. I saw a list of demands. And no way of getting there, no path towards getting there. One of the key things that we have to remember if we go back to, 2009, 2010, was that there was a coherent Obama strategy of getting the Europeans on board, getting China and Russia on board, getting India on board to pressure Iran with sanctions in order to get a deal. And he made it very explicit that they wanted to bring Iran to the negotiating table. He won the trust of those very suspicious international players. That was a strategy. To win their trust, to show them that, no, we don't want to bomb Iran to smithereens. Don't worry about it. We really do want to talk to the Iranians. We're trying to talk to the Iranians. And then, he scored a break with Rouhani getting elected, and that led to, real substantive, constructive talks that led to the nuclear deal. So, that was a strategy. What we have now is, the 12 commandments.
And what impact, this escalation that's going on between the United States and Iran, what impact is it going to have on Iraq?
Well, I hope cooler heads will prevail, and I hope people like Dr. Qadim aren't offended by this, but I kind of see post 2003 Iraq as a kind of child of Iran and the U.S. to a certain extent politically. And although the parents are divorced and hate each other's guts, both want the kid to do well. Maybe one wants the kid to go to law school and another one wants the kid to go to seminary. But they want Iraq to succeed. Iran, I think, genuinely wants a stable and prosperous neighbor, and the United States would also like its adventure in Iraq, misadventure in Iraq, not to go to complete waste.
Abbas Qadim, you agree that, for all the tough talk and muscle flexing we're hearing between Tehran and Washington right now, both are going to handle with kid gloves Iraq?
Well, the best thing for Iraq is to not to have heavy-handed policies or heavy-handed meddling in the Iraqi affairs, both by Iran and the United States and the rest of the international community. A lot of the failure of Iraq, I always assign the majority of the failure to the Iraqi political class, but also there is a lot of blame to go around, and the international community earned its share of the blame. For example, the international community wants from Iraq to have a functioning democracy, yet it does not allow Iraq to have a majority rule. for example. They have meddled in the formation of Iraqi armed forces and the Iraqi government's time and again. There are all kinds of envoys and ambassadors roaming the green zone, making demands. Sometimes they are contradictory demands and mutually exclusive demands. So there is a lot of meddling, and it needs to be stopped. We need to change the meddling into conducive assistance, and that has not been done. So there is a lot of arm wrestling. I don't think that I would be offended, Berzo, by any statement, because I'm not really part of the Iraqi government. Yes, I'm an Iraqi American, but definitely we share a lot of concern about how Iraq has unfolded since 2003. And it's time for Iraq to have a functional government, a government that is based on political platform. None of these political parties right now presented any political economic governance platform that the voters were using to vote for this or that group. We sometimes, even when we talk about Muqtada al-Sadr and others, we exaggerate their role. After all, the highest winner of seats this time did not have more than 1/6 of the parliamentary seats. It is less than 1/4 of what is needed. Less than 1/3 of what is needed to have a coalition to form a government.
So Abbas Qadim, let me ask you on this point.
I don't see how any actor right now will be able to dictate any term or pass his own agenda and preferences.
We have had a country that's lurched from one crisis to the other. There was 2003. There was the rekindling of the Civil War. There was the battle for Fallujah. There was, after that, the standoff with Muqtada al-Sadr, which played out for a long time. The rise and fall of ISIS, Kurdish separatism that has waxed and waned. The last couple of years, we've been asking, can Iraq continue to exist as a federal state? What's going to happen now in the long run? What's going to happen the next time Iraqis go to the polls? What will the country look like?
Well, it all depends on how the next 4 years will shape up. If we go back to the same old politics, I think next time we will not even see the exaggerated 44% turnout. You need to focus on all of the tasks ahead: reconstruction of a nation, reconstruction of a state, reconstruction of the physical infrastructure of Iraq, building an economy that is not rentier, that is completely dependent on oil prices, fighting corruption. All of these will be the checklist for the next elections. And also for the international community. All of the debate that I listened to in Washington, in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Paris, in Moscow, everywhere, is what each country wants in terms of their own preferences for where Iraq needs to go. But what about the preferences of the Iraqis? I mean, those who went and voted for Muqtada al-Sadr's coalition and for the other coalitions, it did not mean that they voted for the U.S. or against the U.S., for Iran or against Iran. They voted for where they see Iraq wants. So I think we need to step away from our Western-centric positions or the whatever camp-centric position and put ourselves in the faces or in the shoes of the Iraqis and see. I mean, these are people who have been bombarded with all of the challenges that you just mentioned, and there is more. And let's remember that the night before the elections, many people went to the votes. Either they went without a meal, or they had no electricity running, or no water. And then we asked them to go and vote for the government. Why? There is a lot of that, and I think the next government needs to reshape Iraq in that way to be able to earn the votes. We cannot move. I mean, there are so many positive signs in the elections. People are reaching across. Prime Minister Abadi was the first or is the first prime minister who wins a major city, Mosul, that is a Sunni city, and he's a Shia. He got seats in Anbar. There are a lot of these things, and also Muqtada al-Sadr's coalition is not all Shia. It has Sunnis, it has communists, liberals, all of that, and people are trying to take choices. But we need to do that, and before everything, for the next elections, we need to abolish the current election law and give Iraqis a decent law. The current law is designed to maintain the same status quo, keep the same
fragmented system.
You only change the
let me just get,
politicians,
because we're running short on time. Let me just get in Borzu Daragahi on this. Borzu, one of the world's leading oil producers with huge electricity outages still. Is that not where the challenges begin for today's Iraq?
Services. This is what Iraqis want. This is what they need. The country's in rather poor shape in terms of infrastructure. The roads have gotten better. The electricity infrastructure is still a disaster. Summer is coming. People are worried about being able to cool their homes. It gets super hot in Baghdad, even hotter down in Basra. There's water shortages. There's municipal services that are lacking. There's a lack of green space. The healthcare system is a complete mess. The education system, though not as bad as, for example, Egypt's, ranks pretty low in terms of public education. And these are the areas where the country is really failing the voters, the Iraqi people.
Borzu Daragahi, many thanks for joining us from Istanbul. I want to thank Abbas Kadim for being with us from Washington. France 24's Douglas Herbert. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
Thank you.
And we say hello to Simon Harding.
Hi, Francois. How are you?
All right. The situation in Iraq and, again, the makeover of Muqtada al-Sadr is certainly something that's been fascinating the media, both in Iraq and in the West.
Absolutely, and it's caused a lot of perplexity around the world. As you were mentioning in the debate, the US, one of the key players in the Iraqi situation at the moment. And I'd like to start with an article from the New York Times, which is entitled, "Once Hated by the US and Tied to Iran, is Sadr now Face of Reform in Iraq?" And that pretty much outlines what you were just saying in terms of how the former cleric is now going to approach things in terms of really bringing Iraq forwards. And a lot of the terminology, however, in the article hints to the confusion that's surrounding the whole situation over there, for example, and also the past that Muqtada al-Sadr has with the USA. One of the lines in the article saying the cleric is best remembered by Americans for fiery sermons, declaring it a holy duty among the Shiite faithful to attack United States forces. And that's certainly something which has been embedded in the mind of Americans. Another line I'd like to draw your attention to is this one here. The man's one demonized by the United States as one of the greatest threats to peace and stability in Iraq. So what we're really seeing is the vocabulary used hinting to the fact that Muqtada al-Sadr might not be all that he shows at the first glance. And that's certainly something that's been felt throughout the media. A second article I'd like to bring your attention to is this one here from Time, which says Iraq just got its own version of Donald Trump. And that headline really speaks for itself in terms of what the article is suggesting. And of course, if we look at the very first line here, says he has been described as an impulsive, narcissist egoist who lives in the shadow of his father. So I think the Times certainly taking their own editorial view on the situation, especially with their comparisons with the president. But it also goes on to say he's also a populist, a political outsider, has hurtled to political power thanks to a surprise election win. And that's certainly, or the rest of the world is viewing this as, a surprise win for him, which leaves the country in a state of not really knowing where they're going to go, which has also been echoed by what we've been seeing in the last couple of days. And then moving on to the second major player in the region, which is Tehran, of course, We have an article here from the Middle East Institute, which is entitled Muqtada al-Sadr's victory in Iraqi election raises alarm in Tehran. And of course, bringing back to light this whole split, once favoured by Iran. He famously, of course, sought refuge there from the United States during the war. And so this whole break from Tehran. And it brings to light the whole idea of Muqtada al-Sadr wanting to reinforce Iraqi sovereignty in his country now, which is one of the main objectives that he's seeking. And then we move on to this article here from the News Decoder. Iraq elections expose Iran's vulnerability, once again reinforcing the idea that that Iran is now at the crossing of paths really as to what to do. And one of your guests was mentioning before, both Iran and the US want Iraq to do well, but of course now with the new leadership, which should be coming up or should be confirmed soon, they don't really know how to go about it.
All right, Simon Harding, many thanks for that. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.